Hello, everyone. My name is Ilva Tare. I'm a non-resident senior fellow at the Atlantic Council's Europe Center in Washington, D.C. This is Balkans Debrief. A looming crisis over the reciprocal recognition of ID cards between Serbia and Kosovo was averted last week after a flurry of diplomatic activity by the US and the EU representatives after a summit between Kosovo's Prime Minister Albin Kurti and Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić yielded no breakthroughs in mid-August. But is the crisis really over? What is the future of Belgrade-Pristina dialogue? And what are the prospects for the broader region moving meaningfully closer to full EU membership? Joining me from Belgrade to discuss all this and more is Christopher Hill, the US ambassador to Serbia. Ambassador Hill is a seasoned diplomat who knows the region extremely well, having extensive experience in helping end hostilities in the Balkans in the 1990s, playing key roles in the Dayton and Rambouillet. Ambassador Chris Hill, welcome to Balkans Debrief.
Thank you very much.
A potentially explosive situation was averted when Serbia agreed to abolish requiring entry documents for Kosovo's ID holders in exchange for Kosovo not enacting reciprocal measures for people entering from Serbia. Is this matter settled?
Well, actually, I think all the negotiators and the parties would say no. They've got a long way to go, and they've got to try to agree on an agenda going forward and try to avoid these kinds of 11th hour crises. There are a lot of important issues, and one doesn't like the important issues to be put behind the urgent issues. So the trick is to make sure you don't have these kinds of urgent issues at 11 o'clock at night.
Well, the issue around license plates is even much harder to solve. Are you optimistic that a solution can be found? What are the next steps?
You know, I would argue that the issue is not license plates. I think the issue goes much deeper. And frankly, there are a number of issues, but I think the key issue, which the parties have agreed to discuss, is the issue of the future of the Serb community in Kosovo. So there have been various ideas. In fact, there was an agreement earlier on when the Brussels dialogue got going, and that agreement was on forming an association of Serb municipalities. So I think there's an understanding that they need to get back to that and see what can be done to kind of make that clear and what it will look like. Because, you know, when you live on the ground, whether it's in Mitrovica or anywhere, you need to know how rules or how laws might be applied. And so a lot of work to do, but I think there's an understanding, no more crises. What they need to do is to get to the hard, important issues, namely, what are Serbs going to, what are their lives going to be like in Kosovo? And ultimately, obviously, we all want to see a normalization, complete normalization of the relations of those two countries because, frankly speaking, they're going to be neighbors for a long, long time.
Mr. Kurti is approaching the dialogue from the perspective that Serbia has to start talking about full recognition of Kosovo, that focusing on intermediate steps has up until now been used by Serbia to drag its feet indefinitely, and that has to change. Is he wrong to demand this?
Well, I think overall the dialogue and the European Union, whose dialogue this is, makes it very clear that it aims for the complete normalization. I think the American side has used mutual recognition. Whatever it is, they've got many steps to go in this dialogue, and I think it's very important to get through these steps. For example, there's an energy issue there where there has not been an understanding, although they're close, of what who provides electricity and what the cost will be and who collects the payments and things like that. So that's one issue that needs to be resolved. There's also an issue of setting up this missing persons effort because there are many lives lost during the Kosovo conflict, and families want to have closure on the loss of their loved ones. So that's another issue that needs to be addressed. But and as I mentioned earlier, this issue of what is going to be the future of the Serb community there. So a lot of things, and frankly, if these things are addressed, and then if there's a normalization, I think the sky's the limit for these two countries. They know each other well, and they should be able to get on with their lives.
Ambassador Hill, as you said, the United States is pushing for a full recognition of Kosovo. Do you have any timeline when they may happen, when Serbia can recognize Kosovo?
I think what's important is really to stress that the United States is really 100% behind the EU's efforts to achieve success in the dialogue. So a U.S. negotiator, Deputy Assistant Secretary Gabe Escobar, has been working very closely with the EU negotiator, Miro Lajcak, and they have really worked together. They were together in Brussels the other day. They traveled together to Pristina, to Belgrade, even to Mitrovica. So I think there's great cooperation between the U.S. and Europe. So rather than talk about what might be endgame differences, I would prefer to focus on the similarities of the approach and the fact that there's really no daylight between the EU and the U.S. And so I think the parties, whether Serbia or Kosovo, should really focus on what's on the table rather than who's sitting at the table, because the U.S. and the EU are together.
But recognition of the independence of Kosovo is definitely on the table.
Oh, I think if you ask the European Union what they mean by full and complete normalization, they probably mean something on that order. But I think what the negotiators are focusing on are the steps that are need to be addressed now, and that includes the issue of the Serb municipalities, includes electricity in the north, includes missing persons, includes a lot of things. And so I'm not sure what the purpose of jumping to the end game is when we haven't gotten through the middle or the muddle of all this.
As you mentioned last week in Belgrade, U.S. envoy Escobar urged Serbs to abandon the narrative that Kosovo is Serbia and instead embracing the narrative that Kosovo and Serbia are Europe. Does this message has any traction in Serbia?
Well, it should. It's a very wise and important message, and I hope people are listening. To be sure, anyone who's lived in Serbia, whether it's in my case 5 months now or 5 minutes, you're aware of how utterly emotional the issue of Kosovo is to many Serbs. So, to view it from afar is to sort of cast aspersions. Why are they doing this? But to live here, and Mr. Escobar has a lot of experience living in Serbia, is to understand how emotional this issue is. Doesn't mean it can't be resolved. We have to stay with it. We have to work closely with our partners and make sure there's an understanding. But I think we can see that there can be progress. I attended something called Open Balkans last weekend. It was quite noticeable the degree to which the Albanian Prime Minister Edi Rama and the Serbian President Aleksandar Vučić had a good rapport with each other, were able to discuss important issues. In fact, the subject of Kosovo came up. And so it's that kind of pattern of cooperation that I hope we could eventually get to.
I will ask you later about the Open Balkan initiative. Also, French President Macron and Chancellor Scholz urged for further steps and actually moving forward quickly with the dialogue process. And they have already assigned 2 advisors along with the EU representative Lajcak to work on this, on the dialogue. What are your thoughts on this move?
I think it's a very strong indication that the Europeans really care about this issue. There are many people who felt that somehow the Balkans, the Western Balkans, would take a back seat now that there's this terrible war raging in Ukraine. But I think it's pretty clear that the European leadership, the presence of Mr. Borrell at the Brussels dialogue, and the continued interest of President Macron and Chancellor Scholz indicates the Europeans understand that you cannot talk about a Europe whole, free, and at at peace unless you can address these issues in the Balkans. So I think it's a very positive step by them, and I hope the reaction in places like Pristina and Belgrade will be to kind of get on with this and understand they have a job to do.
Before talking a little bit more about Serbia, what do you think should Pristina do to assure the Serbian community in Kosovo that the future is safe and secure?
Well, I have difficult enough time giving advice here in Belgrade, so I'll leave the advice in Pristina to my counterpart there, Ambassador Hovenier. I just hope we could reach some agreement and move on to some other issues.
And talking about your problems in Belgrade, Serbia is still not fully aligned with the EU common foreign policy stance on Ukraine, and Serbian public opinion is supportive of Russia. You yourself had some sharp words for Minister Vulin's recent trip in Moscow. How much of a challenge do you think all this will be for Serbia's European path?
All of these issues are challenged, but President Vučić has made very clear on many occasions that Serbia's path is toward European Union, toward alignment with the European Union. Now, you've pointed out some of the differences, including the issue of sanctions, but you didn't mention some of the similarities where the Serbs joined with others, including the European Union, to suspend Russia's membership in the Human Rights Council, where the Serbs joined with others in the General Assembly to condemn the Russian attack on its neighbors. So it's not all bleak in that regard, but you certainly have a point when you mention sanctions. And to that, I would say, we have urged the Serbs to try to come into alignment with that. But I think, again, history is a powerful weight on all of these countries. And in Serbia's case, just the word sanctions has a rather difficult meaning for many Serbs who lived through very tough times in the 1990s under sanctions. So it's an issue which, like many issues in diplomacy, will not be solved in a given day. No one will hit the side of their head with the palm of their hand and say, "Oh, now I understand. We'll change our policy immediately." It's going to take a while, but I think if you look at the broad sweep of this issue, if you look at the broad arc of where Serbia is going, it's heading west. You point out there are opinion surveys that suggest that that many Serbs have sympathies that lie further east. Well, there is some truth to that, but if you look at where Serbian young people are going for their education, for jobs, for their training, and what type of model they see themselves focusing on, it's very much toward the West. So I think our job is to continue to urge that. And I might make one other comment, which is in Serbia, it's a very proud country. They've been around for a long time, and the best way to deal with them is not always to be wagging your finger and giving advice. So there's kind of a limit to what an American ambassador or any ambassador can do with Serbia, except to try to be sympathetic, understanding, and continuing to support, make sure they see the compass clearly and that the direction points west.
There is a perception that the U.S. Is being too soft with President Vučić instead of pushing harder for having him on the European foreign policy on the sanctions. Do you agree with that?
People could have their perceptions. Their perceptions are we're being too soft on Prime Minister Kurti. There are a lot of such perceptions, including in places like Pristina. So rather than rely on perceptions, let's rely on what the policy really is. And the policy is to try to help Serbia move westward, to help it with its own self-declared goal of wanting to do so, of making sure that it complies with European rules and regulations. That's clearly the direction for Serbia, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
Meanwhile, Ambassador Hill, the EU enlargement process seems to be stalled for Serbia at the moment. And also the US State Department has pointed out that there are persistent problems with rule of law and media capture in the country. How do we break this cycle where a lack of perspective disincentivizes reforms?
Well, there's no question that in many countries, Serbia included, there are challenges on independent media, President Vučić has actually said so himself. So there's no question more needs to be done in those areas. And but I would hasten to add that it's not the only country that has these challenges. So the age-old question is, how do you encourage a country to go in the right direction on that? Do you stand back and wag your finger and yell at them? You might do that if you thought that it worked, and most often it doesn't work. So you try to work with them. You try to point out the logic of doing certain things, the logic and, frankly, the international standards of freedom of the press, and try to encourage freedom of the press. I gave a big interview the other day with N1, which is independent media in Serbia. So you try to encourage it, but at the end of the day, it's going to be something that Serbs it's going to have to be a route that they want to take. I think it's fair to say many Serbs are a little discouraged about the pace of European integration, the fact that they've been on this track for some 17 years and haven't seen it yet. So, some people have born and died with the idea that they're going to get in the European Union, and it hasn't happened. But it's not for American diplomats to be offering places in the European Union. We're not in the European Union, but it is for us to be helping these countries, Serbia included, meet the standards of the European Union, because, by the way, they tend to be our standards as well. And help Serbia and help other countries in their aspiration to join these broader structures.
And one of these initiatives that you have supported in the region, as you mentioned earlier, is Open Balkan. So it seems that the U.S. has been quite supportive of this initiative, as long as it remains inclusive, broadly sticks to the EU standards, and does serve as a detour for the broader EU path of the countries participating. Is Open Balkan, Ambassador Hill, succeeding by these measures?
I think it is. First of all, it is open. I mean, anyone who wants to join, and by the way, that includes Kosovo, anyone who wants to join is most welcome. Secondly, it does support EU standards in terms of rule of law, in terms of regulations. It's a little less regulated than some of the other regional initiatives, of which there are many. There's over 70 or 80 regional initiatives. And so this one seems to be more sort of focused on let's get something done rather than let's study a problem for the next 10 years. They really want to get something done, and I give them a lot of credit for that. I would say that the Serbian relationship with Albania is as good as it's probably ever been in history. And I think Open Balkans should get some credit for that. I would very much like to see Kosovo in it. That's going to be up to them. I'd very much like to see Bosnia in it. That's going to be up to them as well. But I think what's important is it's urging its participants to engage in kind of patterns of behavior, of talking with each other, resolving issues through dialogue, of trying to break down barriers. There's a criticism that you sometimes hear in the Balkans that somehow this is some effort by Serbia, which is so big, to dominate the others. That's the kind of criticism you might have heard in the European Union decades ago about Germany. Well, when they would say, well, Germany's too big, surely we don't need a European Union with such a big country involved. I'm not sure it's really that valid a criticism. I think what needs to happen is other countries need to kind of come together and understand this is really something that people want to do. People can do it. They can do it a la carte, or they can do it by the entire menu. It's up to them. So I think it's a very very good process. And by the way, the best thing about Open Balkans is it's made in the Balkans. It's not imposed by anyone else.
But still, the fact that three countries that you mentioned, Kosovo, Bosnia, and Montenegro, are highly skeptical and they are not joining the initiative. What do you think? How do you explain the fact that even though the U.S. supports the Open Balkan, they are still not participating?
I think what's important is for the three countries to have the opportunity to see what is going on there and decide whether they want to join. So I don't see anyone forcing them in. But I mean, the key thing is it needs to be open, needs to be embracing to other countries. There was a representative of Montenegro, the technical prime minister, who has actually been prime minister for several months. He was there, very much supportive. There was a representative of the collective presidency in Bosnia who was there and very, very supportive. Kosovo was not present, but there was nothing secret about Open Balkans. You could see it in any newspaper in the Balkans. So you're absolutely right. Now, there are skeptics, but if you go back to the organization of anything, whether it's EU or whatever, you'll see skeptics. But because there are skeptics is not a reason not to do something.
And on the regional cooperation, Germany appears to be planning to restart the Berlin Process 2.0 this fall. How do you think the Berlin Process ought to work with Open Balkan? Is there room for cooperation?
There is always room for more cooperation, and if Germany wants to do more in the Berlin process, I'm sure they're welcome to do so. I think the key thing is countries need to take an interest, and once you take an interest, a lot of good things can happen.
A last question, Ambassador Hill. Secretary Blinken criticized President Vucic's decision to cancel Euro Pride 2022, which is scheduled to take place in Belgrade, and urged Serbia to renew its commitment to host the event as respect for human rights. Where do things stand on this? Will President Vucic change his mind? Have you been talking to him?
Well, we've certainly talked to him and talked to others about this. And obviously, I stand fully behind Secretary Blinken because people have the right of free assembly. And there's no question it's controversial here, as it is in many countries, but that's not a reason to cancel it. And so I think many of my diplomatic colleagues and myself have urged that the Euro Pride week go ahead, and we'll continue to do that and hope that we get that, because I think it's a symbol of something much broader than just the issue of a parade in Belgrade in September. I think it really speaks to a much broader agenda of tolerance, and so it's an ongoing process, and never easy to do these kinds of things, especially when you talk about the kind of social change we're talking about. But it's something that my diplomatic colleagues and I feel very strongly about.
Ambassador Chris Hill, thank you very much for granting us this interview.
Thank you.
You can follow us at AC Europe on Twitter and in YouTube and as a podcast. Thank you.